The wind, a razor across the barren flats, was the first thing she truly remembered, its howl a chorus to the gnawing emptiness in her belly and the sharper, colder fear that had taken root in her heart. She was a small thing, barely 6 years old, a discarded doll herself, left where the wild grasses met the indifferent stones. Her name was Ilara, though it felt like a word belonging to someone else, someone who had once known warmth, a hand that held instead of shoved. Her parents, figures carved from shadow and sharp words, had driven away in their rattling cart, the sound swallowed by the vast, uncaring sky, leaving her with a thin blanket and a single, damning instruction: don't follow. Your bad luck, girl. Always have been that phrase, bad luck, echoed in the hollows of her mind, a pronouncement of her inherent worthlessness, a truth she had absorbed like the grit that now worked its way into her threadbare dress. Why else would they leave her if she wasn't fundamentally flawed, a burden too heavy to bear? She clutched a wooden horse, its paint chipped, one leg crudely mended with twine, her only companion, her silent confidant. How long could a whisper of hope survive in such a desolate landscape, and what would it take to convince a soul steeped in rejection that it possessed any value at all? Jedediah Thane was a man carved from the same harsh landscape that now cradled the abandoned child. His ranch, a spread of dusty acres and a few lean cattle, was a testament to stubborn persistence rather than prosperity. His face was a map of sun and wind and worry, his eyes the color of a stormy sky, holding a quiet sorrow that rarely surfaced in words. He'd known loss, the sharp, unexpected kind that leaves a permanent ache, and it had taught him a solitude that was both a shield and a prison. He was riding the fence line, a task as predictable and unending as the seasons, when he saw it, a small, dark bundle against the pale earth, too still to be an animal, too small to be anything good. A knot of unease tightened in his chest. He urged his aging mare, Bess, closer, his hand instinctively going to the worn handle of the hunting knife at his belt, a precaution against coyotes or worse. Then he saw the matted hair, the curve of a small shoulder, and the world seemed to tilt. He dismounted, his movement slow, deliberate. The child, for it was unmistakably a child, didn't stir. Her face, when he gently brushed away a strand of dirt-caked hair, was pale, tear-streaked, and utterly exhausted. He saw the faint rise and fall of her chest. Alive! Relief warred with a sudden, fierce anger at whoever could do such a thing. He crouched beside her, his large, calloused hands looking impossibly clumsy next to her fragile form. "Hey there, little one," he murmured, his voice rough from disuse. Her eyelids fluttered, then opened, revealing eyes wide with a terror so profound it struck Jedediah to the core. She flinched, a tiny, wounded animal, trying to curl tighter into herself, her knuckles white around the wooden horse. He saw the state of her, the too thin limbs, the dirt, the utter desolation in her gaze. His own struggles, the failing crops, the dwindling herd, the lonely nights, all seemed to recede in the face of this raw, immediate need. He knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that he couldn't leave her here. It wasn't a thought, it was an imperative, as elemental as breathing. "It's all right," he said, keeping his voice low and steady, the way he'd soothe a spooked colt. "I'm not going to hurt you." He held out a hand, palm up, open. She just stared, unblinking. The wind whipped around them, tugging at her thin blanket. He knew he should check for a note, for any sign of who she was, but a more urgent need pressed. Shelter. Warmth. He couldn't just leave her. He was poor, barely making ends meet. What could he offer a child? But then, what was the alternative? To ride away? The thought was a betrayal of something fundamental within him. He looked at her again, this tiny piece of flotsam washed up on the shores of his harsh existence. "I'm Jedediah," he said softly. "I'm going to take you somewhere warm." "All right." She made no sound, no movement, only that wide, terrified stare. He reached out slowly, carefully, and scooped her up. She was lighter than a sack of feed, a fragile bird in his arms. She stiffened, a silent scream in the tautness of her small body, but she didn't fight, as if all fight had long since been leached out of her. He wrapped her blanket more securely, then his own worn coat around her small frame, trying to shield her from the biting wind as he carried her towards Bess. Her breath hitched, a tiny, almost inaudible sound, before she went utterly limp against him, her head lolling onto his shoulder, the wooden horse still clutched tightly in her hand. The weight of her was both a burden and a strange, unexpected comfort. As he mounted Bess, settling Elara carefully in front of him, he knew this single act had changed the trajectory of his life, a life he'd thought was set in its lonely course. He didn't know her name, or her story, only the chilling evidence of her abandonment. But as Bess plodded slowly towards the distant, humble outline of his ranch, Jedediah felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in years, a purpose beyond mere survival. The little girl in his arms was a question mark, a mystery wrapped in fear, but she was also, perhaps, an answer to a loneliness he hadn't fully acknowledged until this very moment. The path ahead was uncertain, fraught with difficulties he couldn't yet imagine, but for now, there was only the steady rhythm of the horse, the warmth of the small body against his, and the vast, silent land stretching out around them, a witness to this unlikely rescue. The journey back to Jedediah's ranch was a slow, careful passage, each hoofbeat of Bess a soft thud against the backdrop of Elara's terrified silence. She remained limp in his arms, a deceptive weightlessness that spoke of neglect and starvation. He could feel the occasional tremor that ran through her small frame, the way her breath hitched as if even the air she drew was painful. His ranch was not much to look at, a collection of weathered wooden buildings hunkered down against the elements, a small, sturdy cabin, a dilapidated barn, a few straggling corrals. It was a place built for endurance, not comfort, reflecting the man who owned it. He dismounted with Elara still in his arms, her head tucked against his chest, her face hidden. The silence from her was unnerving, more profound than any cry. Inside, the cabin was sparse but clean. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, cold now, a cast-iron stove in the corner, a rough-hewn table and 2 chairs, a single cot. It was a bachelor's existence, stripped to the essentials. He laid Elara gently on his cot, the only soft place in the room, and covered her with a thicker wool blanket. Her eyes, when they met his, were still wide and shadowed, but perhaps with a layer of exhaustion dulling the sheer terror. He moved slowly, deliberately, not wanting to startle her. He built a fire in the hearth, the crackle and flare of it chasing some of earthy gloom from the small room. He didn't speak much, sensing that words were a currency she wasn't ready to trade in. Instead, he focused on actions. He heated some water on the stove, found a clean rag, and gently began to wipe the grime from her face and hands. She flinched at his touch but didn't pull away, her gaze fixed on some distant point beyond the cabin walls. Her skin was cold, her hair lank and matted. The wooden horse lay beside her on the cot, its presence a small, defiant island in her sea of fear. He found an old, soft shirt of his and helped her out of her filthy dress, his touch as impersonal and respectful as he could make it. The shirt swallowed her, but it was clean and warm. He didn't ask questions, didn't pry. He just moved with a quiet purpose, offering the basic comfort she had clearly been denied for too long. He ladled some thin broth, saved from the previous night's meager rabbit stew, into a bowl. He held it out to her, not forcing it, just offering. She looked at the bowl, then at him, her eyes flickering with an unreadable emotion, suspicion, perhaps, or just a deep, ingrained caution. After a long moment, her small, chapped hand reached out, trembled, and took the bowl. She sipped at it slowly, cautiously, as if expecting it to be snatched away. Jedediah sat on the floor by the fire, turning a piece of kindling over in his hands, giving her space. He talked, not to her directly, but to the room, to the fire. He spoke of the land, of the way the creek swelled in the spring, of the hawk that nested in the tall cottonwood by the dry wash. His voice was a low rumble, a calming sound in the quiet cabin. He didn't expect a response, and he got none. But he saw her head tilt slightly, her gaze shifting from the bowl to the fire, then briefly, almost imperceptibly, to him. The internal world of Elara was a maelstrom. Flashes of her parents' angry faces, the sting of a cruel word, the loneliness of being locked in a dark room, the final, terrifying moment of abandonment, these images churned relentlessly. The man, Jedediah, was big, like the men who had hurt her, but his hands were gentle, his voice soft. It was confusing. Her mind, a fortress built against pain, struggled to reconcile this new experience with everything she had known. The doll, Woody, was her only certainty, a tangible link to a time before, though even that time was smudged with unhappiness. She held Woody tighter, his worn woodenness a comfort. The warmth of the fire seeped into her bones, a sensation so foreign it was almost alarming. The broth warmed her belly. These small things were pinpricks of light in a vast darkness. She watched Jedediah. He wasn't looking at her, but she felt his presence, a steady, quiet force in the room. It wasn't like the heavy, threatening presence of her father. This was different. But different didn't mean safe. Not yet. As night deepened, Jedediah made a pallet for himself on the floor near the hearth. He offered Elara the cot. "You sleep there, little one," he said. "You'll be safe." The word echoed in her mind. She didn't know what it meant. She lay on the cot, curled tight, Woody pressed to her chest, and listened to the sounds of the cabin, the sigh of the wind outside, the crackle of the dying fire, the surprisingly gentle rhythm of Jedediah's breathing. Sleep was a treacherous country, populated by nightmares, but exhaustion eventually claimed her, pulling her under into a restless, shallow doze. Jedediah lay awake for a long time, staring into the embers. What had he done? Taking in a girl child no less, was a responsibility he was ill-equipped for. He was a loner, set in his ways. His ranch teetered on the edge of failure. He had nothing to offer her, no softness, no motherly care, no future he could guarantee. The thought of taking her to the nearest town, to the sheriff, crossed his mind. It would be the sensible thing to do. They would find her people, or put her in an orphanage. But the image of her terrified eyes, the way she clutched that pitiful wooden horse, the utter vulnerability of her, it stayed with him. He couldn't do it. Not yet. He had to try. He owed her that, owed it to some forgotten part of himself that still believed in kindness, in the possibility of solace. The vast, empty landscape outside, which usually mirrored his own internal state, now felt different. It felt like a challenge, a space to be filled not with more loneliness, but perhaps, with a fragile, tentative beginning. He didn't know how, but he would protect this child. He would offer her the only shelter he knew, the quiet strength of his presence, the simple honesty of his struggling existence. It wasn't much, but it was all he had. And for now, it would have to be enough. Days bled into a week, each one a quiet unfolding in the small cabin on Jedediah's ranch. Elara remained a ghost, a silent shadow flitting at the edges of his life. She ate the food he offered, small, bird-like portions, her eyes always watchful, her body tensed as if ready to bolt at the slightest unexpected sound or movement. She hadn't spoken a word since he found her, not a syllable, not a whimper that wasn't born of a nightmare. Jedediah, true to his nature, didn't push. He established a simple routine, a rhythm to their days that he hoped would offer a sense of predictability, a fragile scaffold of security in her shattered world. He'd rise before dawn, build the fire, and make coffee. Elara would already be awake, he knew, though she'd feign sleep until he was up and about, her small form a tight knot under the blanket on the cot. He'd talk to her, a low, running commentary on his chores, the weather, the antics of the few chickens he kept. "Morning, little sprout," he might say, his voice gentle. "Son's thinking about getting up. Reckon it'll be a cold 1 inch." He'd then head out to tend to his livestock, Bess, the old mare, a handful of lean cattle, and the aforementioned chickens whose eggs were a vital part of their meager diet. Elara, after a few days of hiding in the cabin, began to venture to the doorway, watching him from the shadows. Her little wooden horse, Woody, was always with her, clutched in her hand or tucked into the folds of the oversized shirt she wore. She observed Jedediah's movements, the way he spoke to the animals, his hands surprisingly gentle as he checked a cow's tender hoof or scattered feed for the clucking hens. He started giving her small, non-demanding tasks. He'd leave a pail by the chicken coop. "If you feel like it, those hens might have left us a surprise or two," he'd say casually, then walk away, not watching to see if she'd do it. The first time she collected the eggs, her tiny hands trembling as she placed them carefully in the pail, Jedediah felt a surge of quiet triumph. She left the pail by the cabin door, not bringing it to him directly, but it was a start. A whisper of engagement. The nightmares were frequent. He'd wake to the sound of her muffled cries, her thrashing on the cot. He wouldn't light a lamp, not wanting to startle her further with sudden brightness. Instead, he'd go to her, sit on the floor beside the cot, and just be there. Sometimes he'd murmur, "You're all right, little one. You're safe here." Just a bad dream. He wouldn't touch her unless she seemed to be in acute distress, and even then, it would be a brief, reassuring pat on the shoulder. He knew that touch, for her, was likely a complicated, frightening thing. One morning, after a particularly bad night, he found her sitting up on the cot, her face pale, her eyes haunted. Woody, her wooden horse, had fallen to the floor, and one of its mended legs had come loose again. She stared at it, a single tear tracing a path down her dusty cheek. Jedediah picked it up gently. "Looks like Woody's had a bit of a tumble," he said softly. He took it to his workbench, a small, cluttered area in the corner of the cabin, and with careful hands, using a sliver of wood and some fresh twine, he repaired the leg, making it stronger than before. He handed it back to her. She looked at the mended horse, then up at him, her gaze lingering for a fraction longer than usual. And then, so soft he almost missed it, a sound. Not a word, but a tiny, breathy exhalation that might have been THNK. He didn't acknowledge it directly, just nodded. "He's a sturdy fella," Jedediah said, gesturing to Woody. "Been through a lot, I reckon, just like some folks." Elara clutched Woody to her chest, her knuckles white. Later that day, as he was mending a piece of tack, she stood near him, closer than she ever had before, watching his hands work the leather. He talked as he worked, telling her about the different kinds of leather, how to treat it, how to make it strong. He told her stories of the land, of the animals, of the changing seasons, drawing on the deep well of his connection to the natural world. He spoke of resilience, of how the scrawniest sapling could cling to a cliff face and survive the fiercest storms, how a wounded animal, if given peace and a chance, could heal. He was planting seeds, he hoped, seeds of a different kind of truth than the one she carried within her. The need for supplies became pressing. Flour, salt, coffee, the basics were running low. The nearest town, Harmony Creek, was a half-day's ride away. The thought of leaving Elara alone filled him with a deep unease. What if she panicked? What if she tried to run? But he had no choice. He explained it to her simply. "I need to go to town, little one. Get some things we need. I'll be back before dark." Promise. He saw the flicker of fear in her eyes, the way she shrank back slightly. He placed a hand on his heart. "I promise, Elara." He hadn't used a name for her, just little one or Sprout, but as he said it, it felt right, a gentle guess. She didn't react to the name, her face impassive. He left her with food and water, the fire banked low. The ride to Harmony Creek was filled with a new anxiety. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat to the small, silent child he'd left behind. He conducted his business quickly, enduring the curious stares of the townsfolk, Jedediah Thane, the recluse, buying more supplies than usual. He ignored their unspoken questions. As the sun began to dip towards the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, he urged Bess homeward, his heart lighter with every mile covered. He found Elara exactly where he'd left her, sitting on the cot, Woody in her lap. When she saw him, her shoulders, which had been hunched tight, seemed to relax, just a fraction. He had kept his promise. He had come back. He didn't know it then, but that small act of keeping his word, of returning when he said he would, laid another stone in the fragile foundation of trust he was trying to build with the lost little girl the world had thrown away. It was a tiny seed, but in the barren soil of her heart, it had found a place to take root. The animals became the bridge. Elara, still cocooned in her silence for the most part, began to show a tentative curiosity towards the creatures that shared Jedediah's sparse existence. There was Bess, the old mare, whose gentle eye seemed to hold a weary wisdom, the few scrawny cattle that grazed in the far pasture, and a lanky, one-eared ranch dog named Patch, a stray Jedediah had taken in years ago, much like Elara herself, though Patch had found his voice in hearty barks and enthusiastic tail wags. It was Patch who first drew a visible reaction from her. The dog, sensing perhaps the child's deep well of sorrow, would often lie near the cabin door when Elara was visible, thumping his tail softly, his good ear cocked, offering a silent companionship that asked for nothing in return. One afternoon, while Jedediah was mending a fence a short distance from the cabin, he saw Elara slowly extend a hand towards Patch. The dog crept closer, nudging his head into her palm. A small, almost imperceptible smile touched Elara's lips before vanishing as quickly as it appeared. Jedediah pretended not to notice, but his heart gave a small leap. He began to involve her more directly with the animals. "Patch looks like he could use some fresh water, if you're of a mind," he'd say, leaving a bucket near the well. Soon, filling Patch's water bowl became her unspoken chore. Then it was scattering grain for the chickens. She moved with a quiet efficiency, her small face serious, her attention focused. He showed her how to groom Bess, how to use the curry comb in long, smooth strokes. The mare would stand patiently, occasionally nudging Elara with her soft nose. "Animals, they know," Jedediah told her one evening, as they sat by the fire, Elara a little closer to him now, though still not touching. "They know if you mean them well. They don't lie, not like some folk." He was teaching her more than animal husbandry, he was teaching her about trust, about the simple, honest language of care. Her vocabulary began to expand, slowly, like a hesitant spring bud. It started with single words, often related to the animals. "Water," she might whisper, looking at Patch's empty bowl. "Bess hungry?" she'd ask, her voice barely audible, as Jedediah measured out oats. He answered her questions patiently, encouragingly. "Yep, Bess is always hungry, that old girl." He didn't press her to speak more, letting her find her own pace. One crisp morning, as a pale sun struggled to warm the frosty air, he was checking on a newborn calf, its mother standing anxiously by. Elara had followed him to the barn, a small, silent observer. The calf was weak, struggling to stand. Jedediah knelt beside it, murmuring softly, helping it to its shaky legs. "Needs a name, this little fella," he said, more to himself than to Elara. He glanced at her. "Got any ideas?" She looked at the calf, then at the pattern of frost on the barn window, then back at the calf. After a long silence, she whispered, "Sparkle." Jedediah smiled. "Sparkle it is." "That's a good, strong name." He saw a faint blush rise on her cheeks. A few days later, he was whittling a piece of wood by the fire, the shavings falling around his boots. He'd been calling her Little One or Sprout, nicknames born of affection and her small stature. But he felt a need to know her real name, to give her back that piece of her identity. He waited for a quiet moment, when the cabin was filled with the companionable silence that was becoming their norm. "You know," he began, his voice gentle, "I've been calling you Sprout, but I reckon you have a proper name." "A beautiful one, I'd wager." Elara looked down at Woody, tracing the mended leg with a finger. The silence stretched. Jedediah waited, not pushing, just letting the question hang in the air. Finally, so low he had to strain to hear, she said, "Elara." He nodded slowly. "Elara. That's a fine name." "A very fine name." He said it again, Elara, letting the sound of it fill the space between them, an acknowledgement, a validation. He saw her shoulders straighten, just a little. It was as if hearing her name spoken with kindness, without the harsh edge of reprimand she likely associated with it, gave it new meaning, a new weight. He began to teach her other things, simple lessons woven into the fabric of their days. He'd draw letters in the dust on the cabin floor with a stick, sounding them out. "A is for apple, though we ain't got any right now," he'd chuckle. "B is for Bess." He taught her to count using pebbles or twigs. He showed her the constellations in the vast, clear night sky, telling her the old stories his own grandfather had told him. Elara was a quick learner, her mind like a thirsty sponge, soaking it all in. One afternoon, they were down by the creek. A young foal, belonging to a wild herd that sometimes passed through Jedediah's land, had wandered close, curious and bold. It came right up to Elara, nuzzling her outstretched hand, its breath warm. A sound escaped Elara's lips, a small, involuntary gasp that turned into something remarkably like a giggle. It was a fleeting sound, brief and fragile, but it was there. Jedediah turned, surprised. Her eyes were bright, a spark of pure, unadulterated delight in them. It was the first time he had seen such an expression on her face. The sight warmed him more than the midday sun. He realized then how profoundly her presence was changing him. The solitude he had once embraced now felt less like a refuge and more like a memory. The silence in the cabin was no longer empty, it was filled with her quiet breathing, her soft footsteps, the occasional whispered word. She was a responsibility, yes, a constant worry, but she was also becoming something more, a companion, a spark of life in his otherwise barren existence. The little girl who had arrived mute with terror was slowly, painstakingly, finding her voice, finding her name, and in doing so, she was helping Jedediah rediscover parts of himself he thought had been lost forever. The language of the animals had opened a door, and through it, the first true sounds of healing were beginning to emerge. The fragile peace of their secluded existence was bound to be disturbed. Harmony Creek, though small and somewhat isolated, had its share of watchful eyes and wagging tongues. Jedediah was a known recluse, his trips to town infrequent and purely functional. So, when Martha Periwinkle, the owner of the general store and the town's unofficial news conduit, saw Jedediah in town for the third time in as many weeks, and on the last occasion, caught a fleeting glimpse of a small, pale face peering from behind his legs, her curiosity, already piqued, went into overdrive. "Jedediah Thane, you're becoming quite the regular," she chirped, her eyes sharp as a magpie's. "And who was that little shadow I saw with you last time? Got yourself some company up on that lonely ranch?" Jedediah, a man of few words, especially with busybodies like Mrs. Periwinkle, had merely grunted, paid for his supplies, and left. But the seed of rumor had been planted. Whispers began to circulate through Harmony Creek like tumbleweeds in a dust storm. "Jed Thane's got a child up there. Where'd he get a child from? Can't be his, can it? Never known him to have a woman. Maybe he found it. Or worse, stole it." The speculation ranged from the curious to the malicious. Some pitied the unknown child, imagining her trapped with the strange, solitary rancher. Others, more suspicious, wondered about his motives. Jedediah felt the shift in the town's atmosphere, the way conversations would hush when he entered the store, the sideways glances, the poorly concealed whispers. It made his skin crawl. He was a private man, and this sudden, unwelcome scrutiny was a heavy burden. He tried to shield Elara from it, but children are perceptive. She sensed the tension in him when they made their infrequent trips to town, noticed the way people stared. She didn't understand the words, but she understood the feeling, the coldness, the judgment. It was a familiar feeling, one that echoed the condemnation in her parents' eyes. She began to retreat again, her nascent confidence wavering. Her voice, which had started to find its footing, grew softer, more hesitant. The light in her eyes dimmed a little. She clung closer to Jedediah in public, a small, frightened barnacle, and back at the ranch, she would spend more time in the cabin, her interactions with the animals becoming less frequent. The fear was palpable in her, fear of these strangers, fear of their judgment, and perhaps the deepest fear of all, that she was the cause of Jedediah's trouble, that her presence, her very existence, was a blight, just as her parents had always told her. One evening, Silas Blackwood, a rancher from a neighboring, more prosperous spread, rode up to Jedediah's gate. Blackwood was a man who considered himself a pillar of the community, self-righteous and officious. "Thane," he called out, his voice carrying an unwelcome authority. "Town's talking. They say you've got a girl up here." "Not your own, by all accounts." Jedediah stepped out of the cabin, Elara shrinking behind him, peering out from the folds of his coat. "What I've got on my land is my business, Blackwood," Jedediah said, his voice low and even, but with an undercurrent of steel. "Not when it involves a child of unknown origin," Blackwood retorted, his eyes narrowing as he tried to get a better look at Elara. "There are procedures, Thane. Questions that need asking. Is she well? Is she safe? Does she belong here?" Elara whimpered, a tiny sound, and burrowed deeper against Jedediah. His arm went around her protectively. "She's well, and she's safe," Jedediah stated, his gaze unwavering. And she belongs right where she is. That ain't for you to decide alone, Blackwood pressed. Folks are concerned. The sheriff might need to pay you a visit. The implied threat hung heavy in the air. After Blackwood left, muttering about civic duty, Jedediah found Ilara trembling. He knelt before her, taking her small, cold hands in his. "Don't you mind him, Ilara," he said, his voice firm but gentle. "Don't you mind any of them. You're safe with me. This is your home now." But the encounter had shaken him. He knew Blackwood wasn't entirely wrong. There were questions, legitimate ones, about Ilara's welfare, about the legality of her staying with him. He was just a struggling rancher, with no official standing, no papers, no rights to this child he had come to care for so deeply. What if they took her away? The thought was a cold fist clutching his heart. He had no money for lawyers, no influence with the town authorities. All he had was his conviction, his fierce, protective love for this little lost girl. That night, he couldn't sleep. He sat by the dying fire, Ilara asleep on her cot, her breathing soft and even for now. He looked at her small, peaceful face, the lines of fear momentarily erased by sleep. He thought of her terror when he found her, the slow, painstaking journey they had made towards trust. He couldn't let them undo it. He couldn't let them send her back to whatever horror she had come from, or to the cold indifference of an institution. He had to find a way. He didn't know how, but he would fight for her. The shadows in the cabin seemed deeper that night, filled with doubts and fears, but as he looked at Ilara, a stubborn resolve hardened within him. She was his now, in a way that transcended blood or law. She was a part of his harsh, lonely land, a fragile bloom in a desolate landscape. And he would protect her, no matter the cost. The whispers of the town were a discordant noise, but the silent language of loyalty and love he shared with Ilara was a stronger, more enduring music. The scrutiny from Harmony Creek cast a pall over the ranch, yet within its weathered fences, Jedediah worked tirelessly to reinforce Ilara's burgeoning sense of belonging. He understood that the whispers and suspicious glances could easily erode the fragile foundations of trust they had so carefully built. He needed to show her, in tangible ways, that she was not a burden, but a cherished part of his life, their shared life. He began by carving for her. Using a piece of smooth, pale cottonwood he'd found by the creek, he spent his evenings by the firelight meticulously shaping a small figure. Ilara would watch him, her chin resting on her knees, her eyes following the movements of his knife as it shaved away slivers of wood, revealing the form hidden within. After several nights, he presented it to her, a perfect, miniature replica of Bess, the old mare, complete with tiny, etched bridle lines. Ilara gasped, her eyes wide with wonder. She took it reverently, her small fingers tracing its smooth contours. It was more than a toy, it was a symbol, a testament to his care and attention. She placed it beside Woody on the small shelf he had built for her few treasures. He also decided to improve her sleeping arrangements. The simple cot, while better than the floor, still felt temporary. With lumber salvaged from a collapsed section of the old barn, he fashioned a small, sturdy bed frame, sanding the wood until it was smooth to the touch. He even bought a new, thick blanket and a small, soft pillow on his next trip to town, enduring Mrs. Periwinkle's knowing smirk with stoic indifference. When Ilara saw the bed, her own proper bed, tucked into a cozy corner of the cabin, her silent gratitude was a palpable thing. She ran her hand over the new blanket, a shy smile gracing her lips. These acts, small in the grand scheme of things, were monumental to Ilara. They were declarations of permanence, of value. Okay, we're about midway through part 6, and it's time for that little chat. If you're finding yourself invested in Ilara's journey and Jedediah's quiet strength, please consider giving this story a thumbs up. And if you haven't already, subscribing to the channel means you won't miss out on how their story unfolds. Your support truly helps bring these narratives to life. We'd also love to hear your thoughts in the comments. What are you hoping for Ilara? Now, let's get back to the ranch, where a new challenge is brewing. The late autumn winds began to bite with the promise of a harsh winter. One afternoon, as Jedediah was out checking snares he'd set for rabbits, he noticed Ilara, who was supposed to be gathering kindling near the woodpile, standing stock still, staring intently towards the line of sparse trees bordering the north pasture. Her posture was rigid, her head cocked. "Ilara? What is it, Sprout?" he called. She didn't answer, but pointed, her small hand trembling slightly. Jedediah followed her gaze. At first, he saw nothing but the swaying trees and the long shadows of the afternoon. Then, a flicker of movement. Low to the ground. A pair of yellow eyes gleaming in the undergrowth. A coyote, gaunt and bold, was stalking the edge of the pasture, its attention fixed on the small flock of chickens pecking near the dilapidated coop. Jedediah's heart lurched. He was too far away to reach them in time if it decided to charge. But Ilara, without a word, acted. She grabbed a nearby fallen branch, thicker than her arm, and, letting out a sound that was half yell, half shriek, a startlingly fierce noise from such a small child, she ran towards the chickens, waving the branch wildly. The coyote, surprised by the sudden, noisy onslaught from this unexpected quarter, hesitated, then turned and melted back into the trees. Ilara stood panting, the branch still held aloft, her small chest heaving. The chickens, ruffled but unharmed, clucked in alarm around her feet. Jedediah reached her side, his own heart still pounding. He knelt, putting his hands on her shoulders. "Ilara!" That was incredibly brave. Pride swelled in his chest, so potent it almost choked him. She had not only seen the danger but had acted, decisively and courageously, to protect their small, vulnerable flock. She looked up at him, her eyes wide, not with fear this time, but with a kind of fierce exhilaration. "Bad dog," she said, her voice shaky but firm. "Go away." Jedediah pulled her into a hug, a rare display of physical affection that she met not with her usual stiffness, but with a surprising willingness, her small arms tentatively going around his neck. "You saved our chickens, Ilara," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You saved them. You're a true ranch hand now." He saw the glow in her eyes at his praise, a deep, resonant pride that lit her from within. It was a turning point. She had contributed, protected, proven her worth not just through her existence, but through her actions. The incident, however, foreshadowed the difficulties to come. The weather turned vicious a few weeks later. An early blizzard swept down from the mountains, a blinding white fury that trapped them in the cabin for days. The wind howled like a demon, piling snowdrifts against the door and windows. The temperature plummeted. Their firewood supply, though diligently gathered, began to dwindle at an alarming rate. Worse, Bess, the old mare, took ill. She developed a hacking cough, her breathing labored. Jedediah worried constantly, venturing out into the storm several times a day to check on her in the frigid barn, forcing warm bran mashes down her throat. Ilara, wrapped in blankets, would watch him go, her small face etched with anxiety. She understood, without him needing to explain, how vital Bess was, not just as a working animal, but as a companion, a part of their small family. One night, the storm reached its peak. The cabin creaked and groaned under the assault of the wind. Bess's cough was worse. Jedediah, exhausted and grim, knew he couldn't leave her alone. "I need to stay in the barn with her tonight, Ilara," he said, his voice heavy. Fear flickered in Ilara's eyes at the thought of being alone in the cabin, but she nodded bravely. "Bess need you," she whispered. He made sure she was secure, the fire stoked, food and water within reach. But as he prepared to leave, Ilara surprised him. She tugged on his sleeve, holding out her newly carved wooden Bess. For luck," she said, her gaze earnest. He took the small carving, his calloused fingers closing around it. "Thank you, Ilara. This means a lot." The night in the barn was a long, desperate struggle. He coaxed Bess, tended to her, talked to her, using every bit of animal lore he possessed. And through it all, he clutched the small wooden horse Ilara had given him, a talisman against the raging storm and his own despair. By morning, the storm had broken, and Bess, though still weak, was breathing easier. The fever had passed. As Jedediah stumbled back towards the cabin, bone-weary but relieved, he saw Elara at the window, her face pressed against the frosted pane. When she saw him, and saw by his weary smile that Bess was going to be all right, her own face broke into a radiant grin. They had weathered the storm, together. The shared struggle, the fear, and the eventual relief, had forged another link in the chain that bound them, a bond tempered in the crucible of hardship, strengthened by a little girl's courage and an old rancher's unwavering devotion. The passing of the blizzard left behind a world transformed, cloaked in a deceptive stillness and a blanket of pristine white. The immediate crisis with Bess had passed, but the harsh winter had truly set in, bringing with it long, dark evenings and a shared intimacy within the small cabin. It was during these quiet hours, with the wind moaning outside and the fire crackling a warm counterpoint, that Elara began, hesitantly, to unearth the fragments of her painful past. It wasn't a sudden torrent, but rather a slow, reluctant seepage, like water finding its way through cracks in a dam. A particular tone in Jedediah's voice, a shadow on the wall, the cry of a distant animal, these small, seemingly innocuous things would sometimes trigger a flicker of memory, a haunted look in her eyes. One evening, Jedediah was mending a tear in his old coat, his stitches careful and practiced. Elara sat nearby, watching him, her wooden horse, Woody, in her lap. Suddenly, she whispered, "Mama used to shout," when thread break. Her voice was small, barely audible above the crackle of the fire. Jedediah paused in his sewing, his expression gentle. He didn't press, didn't ask for more. He simply said, "Sewing can be frustrating sometimes. Takes patience." He understood she wasn't just talking about thread. Another time, he found her staring into the flames, her face unusually pale. They lock me in dark," she said, her voice trembling. "When I cry," a cold fury tightened Jedediah's chest, but he kept his voice calm, soothing. He reached out, not to touch her, but to place a comforting hand on the worn arm of her chair. "That sounds very frightening, Elara." Nobody should be locked in the dark. He didn't try to diminish her experience or offer platitudes. He simply validated her fear, her pain. Slowly, piece by piece, a picture of her former life emerged, a life of neglect, of harsh words, of unpredictable anger, of being made to feel like an unwanted burden. She spoke of hunger, of cold, of a constant, gnawing fear. She never referred to her parents by name, only as they orphaned them, their identities shrouded in the pain they had inflicted. Jedediah listened with a heavy heart. He listened without judgment, without interruption, offering only his quiet presence and an occasional, gentle reassurance. He knew he couldn't erase her memories, couldn't undo the damage that had been done. But he could help her understand that the narrative she had internalized, that she was bad luck, that she deserved the cruelty, was a lie. "Elara," he said one day, after she had recounted a particularly painful memory of being blamed for something she hadn't done. "What happened to you? It wasn't your fault." "Not ever. Some folks, they get lost in their own darkness, their own unhappiness. And sometimes, they try to spread that darkness onto others, especially onto those who are small and can't fight back. But that darkness, it doesn't belong to you. It was never yours to carry." He used the land, the cycles of nature, as his teacher, just as his own grandfather had taught him. He'd point to a tree scarred by lightning but still standing tall, its branches reaching for the sun. "See that old pine, Elara? Been through a lot. Storms, lightning, harsh winters. Got its scars, sure. But it's still strong, still growing. Scars tell a story, but they don't have to be the whole story." He showed her how, after the harshest winter, the first green shoots of spring would push through the frozen earth, a testament to life's resilience. He encouraged her to express herself in other ways. He gave her a piece of charcoal from the fire and a smooth plank of wood. At first, her drawings were dark, jagged lines, chaotic scribbles that seemed to mirror the turmoil within her. But gradually, they began to change. She started drawing animals, Patch, Bess, the chickens. Then, tentative landscapes, the creek, the mountains, the cabin itself. There was a quiet strength emerging in her lines, a nascent sense of order. One afternoon, as a pale winter sun cast long shadows across the snow, Elara was drawing at the table while Jedediah read from an old, worn book of poems he possessed. He stumbled over a word, chuckled at his own mistake, and then, to his astonishment, he heard it, a clear, bright sound, like wind chimes in a gentle breeze. Elara was laughing. A genuine, unrestrained laugh. He looked up, surprised. She was looking at him, her eyes crinkling at the corners, her drawing momentarily forgotten. The sound was so unexpected, so beautiful, it seemed to fill the small cabin with a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. He smiled back, his heart swelling. "Well, now," he said softly. "That's a sound I could get used to hearing." The laughter, like the first robin of spring, was a sign. A sign that healing, however slow, however painful, was possible. The shadows of her past would likely always linger, but they no longer had the power to completely extinguish the light that was beginning to rekindle within her. Jedediah knew the journey was far from over, but in that moment of shared, simple joy, he saw a glimpse of the future, a future where Elara's spirit, once so cruelly battered, could truly soar. He was not just offering her shelter from the storm, he was helping her find the strength to grow, to bloom, even in the harshest of soils. The quiet rhythm of their healing was shattered one late spring morning by the unwelcome sound of approaching hoofbeats, too deliberate and purposeful to be a stray rider. Jedediah was splitting firewood, the rhythmic thud of his axe a familiar comfort. Elara, now a more confident and active presence on the ranch, was nearby, carefully tending a small patch of hardy herbs she'd started cultivating near the cabin door, a project Jedediah had encouraged. Patch, the old ranch dog, let out a low growl, his good ear pricked, his gaze fixed on the track leading to the ranch. Jedediah straightened, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of his hand. A knot of apprehension tightened in his stomach. Visitors were rare and seldom brought good news. Two riders emerged from the Cartonwoods. One was Silas Blackwood, his face set in its usual self-important lines. The other was a stranger, a burly man with cold, assessing eyes and a cruel twist to his mouth that sent a shiver down Jedediah's spine. Beside him, Elara froze, her small trowel clattering to the ground. She recognized something in the stranger's demeanor, a chilling familiarity that spoke of her past. "Thane," Blackwood called out, his voice officious as ever. "Got someone here who's been looking for a lost girl." The stranger dismounted, his movements heavy, predatory. He surveyed the small ranch with a disdainful air, his gaze eventually settling on Elara, who had instinctively moved to stand behind Jedediah, her small hand gripping his worn trousers. "So, this is where you got to, brat," the man sneered, his voice a gravelly rasp that made Elara flinch violently. "Took long enough to track you down." "Your ma's been worried sick," he said it with a smirk that belied any genuine concern. Jedediah stepped slightly in front of Elara, a protective shield. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice dangerously quiet. "Name's Carl." "Carl Grisham," the man said, hooking his thumbs into his belt. "I'm her uncle. Her mother's brother. Come to take her back where she belongs." Elara let out a small, terrified whimper. "No," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Don't want to go." Grisham's eyes narrowed. "Ain't your decision, girl. Your family. You come with me." "She's not going anywhere with you," Jedediah stated, his stance unyielding, his hand moving almost imperceptibly closer to the axe still embedded in the chopping block. Blackwood shifted uncomfortably. "Now, Thane, let's be reasonable. This is her kin. He has a right to the right." Jedediah's voice was laced with contempt. "What right does kin have when they abandon a child to die in the wilderness?" "She was half-starved, terrified, left for dead when I found her," Grisham scoffed. "Just toughening her up. She was always a difficult child, a burden. My sister, well, she ain't got the patience. But blood is blood. We'll take care of her now." His eyes roamed over Elara again, and Jedediah saw a flicker of something ugly in them, not care, but calculation. Perhaps he saw a future unpaid servant, a drudge. Panic, cold and sharp, seized Elara. The carefully constructed walls of safety and trust Jedediah had built around her seemed to crumble. This man, this uncle, was a specter from the nightmare she thought she had escaped. The thought of returning to that life, to the darkness and the cruelty, was unbearable.
I?
I stay with Jedediah. Ilara cried out, her voice surprisingly strong despite her terror. She stepped out from behind Jedediah, her small chin lifted defiantly, her eyes blazing. He's my family. The words, spoken with such conviction, hung in the air. Grisham looked momentarily taken aback by her vehemence. Blackwood, too, seemed surprised by the fierceness of the small girl. Jedediah placed a reassuring hand on Ilara's shoulder. You hear her, he said to Grisham. She's made her choice. A child's choice means nothing, Grisham sneered, taking a step forward. She's coming with me, one way or another. That's not going to happen, Jedediah said, his voice dropping to a deadly calm. He subtly shifted his weight, positioning himself more fully between Grisham and Ilara. The tension was a palpable thing, thick and dangerous. Patch, sensing the imminent conflict, began to bark furiously, a deep, menacing sound. Blackwood, clearly not anticipating such direct confrontation, looked increasingly uneasy. Perhaps, he began, we should discuss this calmly. Maybe go into town, talk to Sheriff Brody. Jedediah considered this. Sheriff Brody was a fair man, generally respected. It was a risk, but a direct confrontation with Grisham here and now could turn violent, and Ilara's safety was paramount. All right, Blackwood, Jedediah conceded, his eyes never leaving Grisham. We'll go see the sheriff. But Ilara stays by my side, Grisham grumbled, but seemed to recognize that forcing the issue here, with Jedediah armed and the dog agitated, might not be wise. The ride into Harmony Creek was a tense affair. Ilara rode pillion with Jedediah on Bess, her small arms wrapped tightly around his waist, her face buried in his back. She trembled uncontrollably, the fear a living thing inside her. Jedediah kept up a low murmur of reassurance, though his own heart was heavy with foreboding. This was the test. The test of their bond, of Ilara's newfound voice, and of the compassion, if any, that existed in the wider world beyond their isolated ranch. The fate of the little girl, who had already endured so much, now rested on the judgment of others, and on her own courage to speak her truth in the face of the very shadows she had fought so hard to escape. The encounter had brought the past crashing into their fragile present, and the question of who truly had a claim on Ilara, the blood ties of a cruel family or the heart ties of a loving protector, was about to be laid bare. The small, dusty office of Sheriff Brody felt suffocating. Ilara sat on a hard wooden bench beside Jedediah, her hand clutching his tightly. Across from them, Carl Grisham slouched in a chair, a smug look on his face, while Silas Blackwood stood near the doorway, looking uncomfortable but self-righteously involved. Sheriff Brody, a weathered man with kind eyes but a no-nonsense demeanor, listened patiently as Blackwood recounted the situation, followed by Grisham's assertive claim of kinship and his intention to reclaim his niece. Jedediah then spoke, his voice low and steady, detailing the circumstances under which he had found Ilara, abandoned, terrified, and neglected. He spoke of the slow process of earning her trust, of her healing, of the home they had made together. He didn't embellish, didn't plead, he simply stated the facts as he knew them, his quiet conviction more powerful than any rhetoric. Throughout it all, Ilara remained silent, her gaze fixed on her lap, Woody the wooden horse clutched in her free hand. When Jedediah finished, Sheriff Brody turned his attention to the child. Ilara, he said gently, his voice surprisingly soft. This is a difficult situation, young lady. Mr. Grisham here says he's your uncle, your mother's brother. Is that true? Do you know this man? Ilara flinched at the mention of Grisham's name. She looked up, her eyes wide with fear, and nodded almost imperceptibly. Yes, sir, she whispered, her voice barely audible. And he says your mother wants you back. That she's worried about you at this. A flicker of something unreadable crossed Ilara's face, not hope, but perhaps a painful resignation, a deep-seated knowledge of the untruth of that statement. Grisham leaned forward. See, Sheriff? She knows me. It's all straightforward. My sister wants her girl home. Sheriff Brody held up a hand, silencing Grisham. He looked back at Ilara. Ilara, I need you to tell me, in your own words, what you want. Do you want to go with Mr. Grisham? Do you want to go back to your mother? This was the moment. The culmination of all her fear, all her pain, but also all her newfound strength and the tentative hope Jedediah had nurtured in her. The room was silent, waiting. Jedediah squeezed her hand reassuringly but said nothing, knowing this had to be her voice, her choice, if it was to have any weight. Ilara took a deep, shaky breath. She looked at Grisham, at his cold, expectant face, and a shiver ran through her. Then she looked at Jedediah, at his kind, worried eyes, at the steady strength that had been her anchor for so many months. She thought of the warmth of the cabin, the feel of Pat's fur beneath her hand, the taste of Jedediah's slightly burnt biscuits, the pride she felt when she gathered eggs or helped mend a fence. She thought of her little carved Bess, and her own bed, and the sound of Jedediah's voice reading to her by the fire. This was home. This was safety. This was love. No, she said, her voice small but clear, gaining strength with each word. I don't want to go with him. My mother, she didn't want me. They left me. Her gaze flickered towards Grisham. He was not kind, Grisham scoffed. She's a child, Sheriff. She doesn't know what she's saying. Confused, that's all. I'm not confused. Ilara exclaimed, surprising everyone, including herself, with her sudden ferocity. Tears welled in her eyes, but she didn't back down. They were mean. They said I was bad luck. They left me in the dirt to die. Jedediah saved me. She turned to the sheriff, her small face earnest, pleading. He's good. He's kind. He teaches me things. I help him. We have Patch, and Bess, and the chickens. It's my home. Please, Sheriff. Please don't make me go back. Her voice broke on a sob, but she held his gaze. Sheriff Brody looked at Ilara for a long moment, his expression unreadable. He then turned to Grisham. Mr. Grisham, the child has spoken quite clearly. And frankly, Mr. Thane's account of finding her aligns with what she's implying about her previous care, or lack thereof. She's lying. Ungrateful brat. Grisham snarled, half rising from his chair. Sit down, Mr. Grisham, Sheriff Brody said, his voice suddenly hard as iron. I've heard enough. While blood ties are one thing, the welfare of a child is another. And from what I've seen and heard, this child's welfare is best served by remaining in the care of Mr. Thane. Relief, so potent it was almost dizzying, washed over Jedediah. He felt Ilara sag against him. Grisham sputtered, outraged. You can't do this. She's my blood. I can, and I am, Sheriff Brody stated firmly. Unless you can provide compelling evidence that you and her mother can offer a safe, stable, and loving home, something your niece's testimony and Mr. Thane's evidence strongly contradict, Ilara stays with Jedediah Thane. I'll be filing a report, and I'll be making regular checks. If you cause any trouble for them, Mr. Grisham, you'll answer to me directly. Grisham glared, his face purple with rage, but he seemed to recognize the sheriff's unshakable resolve. He muttered a curse, grabbed his hat, and stormed out of the office, Silas Blackwood trailing awkwardly behind him after a mumbled apology to the sheriff. The threat was gone, at least for now. Ilara was trembling, exhausted but victorious. Jedediah pulled her into a gentle hug. You did it, Ilara, he whispered, his voice thick with pride and emotion. You spoke your truth. You were so brave. Sheriff Brody watched them, a small, almost imperceptible smile on his lips. Mr. Thane, he said, you've done a good thing by this child. It's clear she trusts you, and that you care for her deeply. We'll need to sort out some formalities, guardianship papers, that sort of thing. But for now, take her home. As they walked out of the sheriff's office into the sunlight, Ilara felt lighter than she had in her entire life. She had faced her past, spoken her truth, and had been heard. She looked up at Jedediah, her eyes shining. He smiled down at her, a smile that reached his eyes, and spoke of a future they would now consciously build together, a future defined not by the cruel claims of a bitter past, but by the enduring bonds of love and chosen family. They began to actively forge that future, a tapestry woven with shared work, learning, and quiet affection. The guardianship papers, facilitated by a surprisingly helpful Sheriff Brody, were eventually drawn up and signed, a legal affirmation of the bond that had long existed in their hearts. Jedediah, with Ilara now a more confident and capable partner, began to make small improvements to the ranch. They mended fences together, Ilara handing him tools, her small hands surprisingly deft. They planted a small vegetable garden, Ilara meticulously tending the seedlings, her joy evident with each new sprout that pushed through the soil. She learned to read with fluency, devouring the few books Jedediah possessed and any old newspapers he brought back from town. Her drawings became more vibrant, filled with color, using berry juices and colored clays Jedediah helped her find, and life. She was no longer just a survivor, she was thriving. She started to care for Jedediah in her own quiet ways, noticing when he was tired, ensuring he had a hot drink, mending his clothes with stitches that grew neater with practice. Their evenings were filled with shared stories, sometimes from books, sometimes from their own imaginations. The cabin, once a bastion of solitude, now echoed with soft laughter and easy conversation. One spring, they planted a young apple sapling near the cabin, a symbol of their new beginning, a promise of future sweetness. As they firmed the earth around its roots, Jedediah looked at Ilara, her face smudged with dirt, her eyes bright with purpose. "This tree will grow strong here, Ilara," he said. Just like you, she smiled, a wide, genuine smile that transformed her face. The little girl who was left to die, who believed herself to be bad luck, had found her roots, her home, and her family, not in blood, but in the fertile ground of unwavering love and acceptance. Years passed, seasons turning with the steady, unhurried rhythm of the ranch. Ilara, once a small, terrified sprite, grew into a young woman, slender and strong, with eyes that held both the quiet wisdom of her past hardships and the bright resilience of her reclaimed spirit. She was perhaps 14, maybe 15, her exact age still a gentle mystery, but she carried herself with a grace and capability that belied any specific number. The ranch, while still a place of hard work and modest means, was no longer just Jedediah's struggle, it was their shared endeavor, their sanctuary. Ilara moved with an easy familiarity across its acres, her knowledge of the land and its creatures as profound as Jedediah's own. She could mend a fence with skill, calm a spooked calf with a soft word, predict the weather by the feel of the wind and the color of the sky. Her hands, though still bearing a youthful delicacy, were competent and sure, whether she was tending her thriving garden, baking bread in the old stove, or sketching the landscape with charcoal sticks she made herself. The shadow of her early years had not vanished entirely, such scars rarely do, but it no longer defined her. It was a part of her story, a testament to her incredible strength, but it did not hold power over her present. The false belief of her own worthlessness, so cruelly ingrained by her parents, had been painstakingly uprooted and replaced by a quiet, unshakable sense of self-worth, nurtured by Jedediah's unwavering love and belief in her. She often found herself gazing out at the vast expanse of land that stretched from their cabin to the distant, hazy mountains, the same landscape that had once seemed so terrifying and indifferent. Now, it felt like an embrace, a silent, steadfast witness to her transformation. She remembered the biting wind, the gnawing hunger, the crushing loneliness of her abandonment, but these memories were no longer sharp shards of pain. They were like old, faded photographs, reminders of how far she had come, of the profound kindness that had altered the course of her life. The little wooden horse, Woody, still sat on her bedside shelf, alongside the carved bess, symbols of her journey from utter desolation to belonging. Jedediah, his hair now mostly silver, his face more deeply etched with the lines of time and weather, watched her with a quiet, immense pride. His act of compassion, born from a simple, human impulse on that desolate day years ago, had not only saved Ilara, but had also brought an unexpected richness and meaning to his own solitary life. She was the daughter of his heart, the unexpected bloom in the winter of his existence. Their communication was often unspoken, a comfortable understanding built over years of shared sunrises, shared chores, shared laughter, and shared silences. He saw the woman she was becoming, intelligent, compassionate, resilient, and his heart swelled. He had given her a refuge, and she, in turn, had given him a family, a purpose beyond mere survival. One cool autumn evening, they sat on the porch of the cabin, a place they had expanded together, watching the sun dip below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and deep violet. Patch, now old and grey-muzzled, lay at their feet, his tail thumping softly. Ilara was sketching in a worn leather-bound journal Jedediah had gifted her, capturing the fleeting beauty of the sunset. "Do you remember," Ilara said softly, her voice a gentle melody, "the first time you brought me here? I was so scared. I thought the world was only made of mean." Jedediah reached over and placed his calloused hand over hers. "I remember, Ilara. I also remember a very brave little girl who held onto a wooden horse like it was the most precious thing in the world." Ilara smiled, a wistful, tender expression. "Woody was all I had. Until I had you." She looked at him, her eyes clear and full of a deep, abiding affection. "You taught me that I wasn't bad luck, Jed. You taught me that I mattered. You always mattered, Ilara," he said, his voice a little gruff with emotion. "You just needed someone to see it. Someone to help you see it in yourself." The air grew cooler as twilight deepened, the first stars beginning to prick the darkening sky. The apple tree they had planted years ago stood sturdy and laden with fruit nearby, a living testament to their shared life, its roots deep in the soil of the ranch. Ilara leaned her head against Jedediah's shoulder, a familiar gesture of comfort and trust. The quiet strength of dawn, which had once illuminated her desperate plight, now heralded each new day as a gift, a testament to the enduring power of love, the resilience of the human spirit, and the profound beauty of a life not just reclaimed, but truly, deeply cherished. She was no longer the little girl left to die by wicked parents. She was Ilara of the ranch, strong, beloved, and finally, undeniably, home.